Well, good afternoon. For those who have been with us for just a minute, I did say good morning a moment ago, but it is like 30 seconds past the hour, so I can officially say good afternoon. Thank you for joining us this morning for our Lunch and Learn, preparing for the Admission and Release Committee, the ARC, Individualized Education Program IEP meeting. My name is Amber Ham, and I am the Training and Outreach Coordinator with Kentucky Spin. And I'm going to walk you through a few housekeeping items before we jump right in this afternoon. I had to watch myself. We are Kentucky Spin, Kentucky Special Parent Involvement Network. We are funded by the U.S. Department of Education under IDEA since 1988, when Kentucky first received PTI. Kentucky Spin Parent Center provides training and information and support for children and youth with all types of disabilities, birth through 26 years, and their parents, families, as well as professionals. It is easier to tell you what we do not do in comparison to what we do at Kentucky Spin. We do not act as attorneys. We do not represent families, and we do not give legal advice. With that being said, we do empower families to advocate for their children effectively by providing that peer-to-peer support so that families can access the needed information and resources that are available to them. A disclosure for today's training: this is not a training of trainers event. Kentucky Spin does not authorize any other agencies, organizations, or individuals to train on this material. This presentation is for educational use only, and all rights are reserved by Kentucky Spin Incorporated. I want to also let everyone know that there is closed caption available during today's session that is live. There has been a link placed in the chat for you if you need to utilize that function. We also will be checking the chat function and the Q&A if there are questions entered throughout the training, and we will try to answer those as soon as we see those, or we take a moment to be able to go over those questions. We will be providing links for all the material that you see today. If you're unable to grab that during this training, I will be sending a follow-up email, and all of those links will be sent to you within the next 24 hours. And at this time, I am going to hand things over to Eileen Hoover and let her tell you about what we'll be going over today.
All right. Well, I almost said good morning myself. Good afternoon. My name is Eileen Hoover. I am Kentucky Spin's early education parent educator. And so today we're going to be going over the IEP. So for today's agenda, we have who's a team member, the content of the IEP, least restrictive environment and decision making, and then meetings of the IEP team. So the next slide. So we're going to start right into, once an eligibility determination is made that the child needs special education and related services. So that first IEP meeting is going to be, must occur within 30 days of that eligibility. When they say days, they do mean business days or school days. So weekends and holidays do not count. And so you want to make sure that they have that time to schedule that meeting and that it's done in an appropriate time frame. So what you have first to know about the meeting is something called prior written notice. So this is the notice that's given to parents by the agency or the school, and they must indicate the purpose of the meeting, the time, and the location, and who is going to attend. It's also meant to give an idea of who will be at this meeting so the parent can come and make sure that they can meaningfully participate in these meetings. So if for whatever reason they select a day or a time that does not work for you, you can request for them to reschedule those meeting times so that way you're able to participate. So now we're going to talk about who's actually included on the IEP team. So the first person we talk about is the child's parent or their educational representative. It's very important that you are involved inside of this meeting because the ARC team is a team and you are an equal member of that team. So we want to make sure that you are able to participate in that meeting and that you're able to make sure you're able to advocate for your child effectively and have the opportunity to participate. Let's see here. Next is going to be, so whenever the public agency, they must take any actions or whatever actions that are necessary to ensure that the parent understands the proceedings of the IEP team meeting, including if a parent needs interpreters. So if you have somebody who is deaf or hard of hearing, if their native language is not English, you need to make sure that that parent is able to meaningfully participate in this meeting. And also that the child is not the person who's going to be used as a translator. That's something that the school needs to provide so that way everyone understands what is going on at those meetings. So other people we have is going to be the special education teacher. So we need no less than one of the child's special education teachers, or at least one of the special education teachers there that works with the student. It could also be the child's special education provider, but we need to make sure that they're represented at those meetings so that way they're able to help with the modifying of general education curriculum to help the child learn how to use supplementary aids and services so they can stay in the regular classroom or elsewhere, how to modify testing, and just overall helping write the IEP to make sure that it is an all-encompassing process that everyone participates in and that we hear voices from every area so that child can be supported. So besides the special education teacher, it's also going to be the regular education teacher. So if a child is or may be participating in regular education environment, so at least one of the child's regular education teachers. So this is the teacher that is going to be, for most of it, determine what's going to be appropriate support inside of that regular education classroom and know what the curriculum is. So what would be the curriculum, and then the special education providers can help show how they can modify that curriculum to best support that child. So there's a couple more people, but all these people have their own space inside of this meeting, and it's important that they all attend so that way we can have the best idea of how to prepare and how to help the child be supported inside of the school. Next up is going to be representative of public agency. So they have to be qualified to provide specially designed instruction to meet the needs of this child with disabilities. They have to be knowledgeable about general education, knowledgeable about availability of resources. So generally this tends to be somebody from administration, either a principal or a vice principal, but somebody that has the knowledge and the decision-making power of being able to enact anything that the ARC team decides. So while the ARC team can decide that this child may need a particular thing so that they can participate in school and they can access education, we need somebody on the administrative side to say that this is how they're going to be able to do it, to make sure it's something that can be acted upon. So more people that are coming to this wonderful meeting, the individuals who can interpret evaluation results. So this may be already somebody that's on the IEP team for another purpose, but it cannot be that child's parent. So what this is saying is that if your child had something like an observation assessment or test for, let's say, gross motor skills, which tends to be something we do with a physical therapist. If the physical therapist, wasn't able to attend and they had all their notes written up, the janitor couldn't come in and just read the notes. We need somebody that's able to read those notes, interpret those notes, and be able to participate in that meeting. So it's not just anybody that can read, it's going to be somebody that knows how to read those particular assessments. Let's see, we also have others with knowledge or special expertise about the child. So this can be somebody at the discretion of the parent or the agency, but this is going to be anyone that has knowledge or special expertise about the child and it's determined by whoever invites them to be a part of the IEP team. So this could be an outside therapist. Maybe your child's in ADA and their BCBA, their therapist has some insight as to what works for the child, what doesn't work for the child. You as the adult, the parent, the guardian are allowed to ask them to attend these meetings because they have that type of insight that can help the school understand what it's going to take for that child to be successful. It can also be sometimes just support people, family, friends, somebody that's there for support for you, or somebody that, again, knows the child and is able to help participate in those meetings. And then last but definitely not least is going to be the child with a disability. So this is the focus of everything that we're doing. Without that child, this meeting doesn't happen. So they must be invited to attend whenever appropriate. And they must be invited to meetings where post-secondary goals and transition services are needed to reach those goals are going to be considered. So we always kind of talk about that, you know, when kids are in kindergarten, it's really hard for them to participate in these kind of very technical meetings, but it's important that we always bring the focus back to center on that child and what their needs are. So if a kindergartner came in, you may have them say this is something they like about school, something they find difficult about school, something, so that way their thoughts and preferences are taken into account. And as they get older, we're able to invite them to the meetings themselves, because once they get to the age of transition, they're going to be the ones that we're going to be asking them what do they need and how have them meaningfully participate inside of these meetings, because it's about their lives, and we want them to have a voice and to be able to advocate for themselves. So let's see here. Next up is going to be excusing a member from attending the meeting. So when a member of the IEP teams are not being modified or discussed, the member can be excused in whole or in part, but the parent has to agree along with the LEA, the local education agency, or the school, that the member's attendance is not necessary. So it can't be you're in the middle of a meeting and somebody has to go pick up their class, and if you don't feel like that you're okay with them leaving because they still have information, then you can say that you don't want them to leave yet, or that you can reschedule that meeting. But if you do excuse a member from attending those meetings, it has to be in writing. And so again, it is only done upon approval of both the parent or the guardian of the child and the actual school itself can say that this is something that we can do at this time. It's not, I don't think it's done very often or frequently, because a lot of times everyone really needs to be at that table to make sure we have all the information for these kids. So parent participation at the meeting. So can the agency hold this meeting without the parent in attendance? The short answer is yes, and that is only if the agency or the school is unable to convince the parents to attend. So that is something where you have your prior written notice that they're sending you to try and schedule days and times that everyone will be available so that you can participate. But there are occasions where schools reach out and make repeated attempts that they are unable to reach the parents for one reason or another, and they decide to move forward with continuing so that way the child is getting the special education that they need to be supported in the school, but it must be very well documented and detailed records of all the attempts to actually reach out to parents and make sure that they have that opportunity to participate. So again, this is also something that doesn't happen super often because everybody wants to be sitting at that table to be as child-focused as possible. So we're going to talk about transition, so about the student and the previously discussed participants. So representatives of other agencies likely to be responsible for providing or paying for transition services. So this is when your child is approaching adulthood, the team needs to start considering the services that the child needs to build a bridge into that new world. So OVR is one that we commonly see that is invited in, or Office of Vocational Rehab, because those are going to be the areas that have resources to make that transition and having them involved before they, we don't want the kids to graduate or leave school and not have a support system waiting on the other side. So it's building that bridge of others coming to those meetings. But of course, we need to make sure that there is consent. So before those agencies can be invited to represent for other agencies and be invited into those meetings where those post-secondary goals are made, we need to make sure that parents are aware. And at that time, if the student has their own autonomy, that they're able to consent as well. And that consent is done in writing to make sure that everyone is on the same page. Another time that we talk about for transition is we've just talked about how students are transitioning into adulthood. And the other time is when a parent are asking about moving from something called under IDEA, or the Individuals with Disability Education Act, Part C to Part B. Part C in the state of Kentucky is known as KEYS, Kentucky Early Intervention System. It was formerly known as First Steps. This is for children with disabilities aged 0 to 3 years old, and it allows them to get the services they needed in home or in their preferred area. And once they turn 3 years old, then they move into Part B of IDEA, which is from ages 3 to 21. And then that's when we're talking about the public education system, and knowing that that is a transition time as well, going from the early intervention services and jumping over to the actual public education system.
And Eileen, we do have a question. What age does transition start occurring? And I know you just answered that for Part C going into Part B, but can you answer that as far as transitioning into adulthood?
No, absolutely. So you always want to start getting your child involved. The earlier the better. And I say this as someone who has a 6th grader. Oh my God, got a middle schooler now. And so, while we're not necessarily looking at post-secondary educational goals just yet, we are starting to talk about it. In Kentucky, I believe it's the age of 14, or when they're in the 8th grade, is when that student has to start being invited to that meeting. And then from there, they get to decide whether or not the parent is still going to be the sole person of their educational goals, but we want them to start participating, because being a self-advocate is so incredibly important. Because while we can help and foster these children as they grow up, our ultimate goal is that they're going to be as independent as they're able to be. And the more you can start letting them dip their toes into the system to know how this is set up to help them, the better it is for them overall. Excellent question. So I'm probably going to say this a million times today. So special education, the statement of special education and related services and supplementary aids are to be provided to or on behalf of the child. Special education is not a place. It is not a room. It is not a particular area of the school. It is not a place. Special education is completely integrated into all areas of the public education system. So it is meant to be used inside of the general education classroom, inside of the specials, inside of gyms, extracurricular activities. This is, again, only way I can think to describe it is that it's not a place. It's not the room at the end of the hall that it had been in the past. This is something that is completely integrated throughout the school. So we're going to kind of dive into how the IEP is set up. So the first part of the IEP is present levels. The child's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. So it's going to include how a child's disability affects the child's involvement and the progress in the general education curriculum. Everything is based on what those present levels are. So those should give an accurate depiction of what your child is doing and how they compare to similar aged peers. And so if they have a communication issue, how does that communication issue keeping them from being at the same as others in their age and grade? I think Rhonda's correcting me in the chat, so. So she said, yes, eighth grade or age 14, whichever comes first, talking about those transitions. The student must be invited and start transition planning, but the IEP team can start way before then working on it. Thank you, Rhonda.
And I just want to throw
So
out there also, sorry, Eileen, I didn't mean to cut you off.
you're fine.
When we're looking at present levels, we may be looking at a student that has multiple disabilities that hinder their educational success or outcome. Excuse me. So the student may have an IEP listed under one disability category. The present levels is going to be the area, like in my son's case, his IEP is under autism. With that being said, in his present levels, we have included the other diagnoses or disabilities that he has that hinder his educational outcome. So that is where we would list those so that we can get supports to also help those the other disabilities. It's not going to just be one disability at the top of the IEP if the student has several. So it's really important to know that that's where we would list the other disabilities that the student has and how it does affect their educational outcome.
Thank you, Amber. One of the other things I just want to touch on briefly for the present levels is the functional performance, which is something that sometimes parents get a little flustered that maybe a child has behavioral concerns or something along those lines that not necessarily deal directly to an academic achievement, but being able to function inside of the school and being able to access education wherever that is how those different things can be pulled into an IEP to make sure that the child is supported throughout all areas. So after you learn what the present levels are, this is done through the tests and observations, you have your annual goals. So measurable annual goals include the academic and functional goals. And so they're designed to meet the child's needs that result from the child's disability, to enable the child to be involved and make progress in the general education curriculum, and to meet each of the child's other educational needs that result from that child's disability. So the annual goals are the roadmap. And so where's the child going this year? You know, what are they going to work on academically and in terms of functional development? So continuing with goal writing, writing goals can be one of the harder parts of an IEP. So what does the child need to learn or do academically? What do they need to learn to or do functionally? And then what's reasonable to achieve in a year's time? And can you measure whether or not that child has reached that goal? So we're going to talk next about how we create those goals, that we want them to be SMART goals. And that kind of breaks down, thank you, what these are. So when you have this goal, it should be SMART and not necessarily that any goal can be, I'm going to say, quote unquote, dumb or not well, but we're using the SMART as a guide. So specific. You want to make sure your goals are clear and specific. You don't want to just say, like, you know, the student will be able to read. Read what? Read how much? So you want to make sure that they're really specific in how they are actually writing out that goal, that they're able to read on grade level with an 80% success rate. So that's your S. So you want M, you want measurable. You want to be able to measure those aspects. So if they're able to read on grade level, how do we know it's at 80%? Is it done by a checklist? Is it done by an observation? Is it done by a test? There's lots of different ways, but that goal should be written so we know how we're going to measure it. A is for attainable. So are your goals attainable? We all have very lofty goals for all of our children to one day hopefully be independent human beings, but is that going to happen in a school year? And if not, how do we break down those larger goals into smaller ones that a child can achieve reasonably within about a year's time, or at least an academic year? R is going to be for relevant. So make sure your goals are relevant, that it has something to do with the academic or the functional performance and success of the child. And T is going to be for time-based. because you want to make sure that it's set up within a certain amount of time. Like I said, we only have so much time during the year, and we don't want to just leave a big lofty goal that maybe we're not making steps towards. So when you're making these goals, you want to make sure that they follow that kind of smart thing, so that way you have an idea of like how they're going to get to those goals, how long is it going to take them, you know, is it something they can do within a year? And sometimes because goal writing is so difficult that you may have to rewrite it, that you may have parts of it that look really great. But if you kind of go back and go, you know what, we're missing, you know, is this time based? You know, we're talking about a goal that's 2 years long. We need to break that up into something into shorter, manageable bits for this child. So you have your present levels, you have your goals. Now we're going to talk about progress reporting. So you're going to have periodic reports that will be provided on the child's progress toward meeting those annual goals that you had just created. So normally, I say normally, a lot of schools do a quarterly or periodic. So it's easier that a lot of schools will, once they put out report cards, they'll also be giving out how your child is moving towards those goals that you made throughout the year. And that can be done, you know, for me personally, I always end up getting an extra sheet of paper sent home with a graph showing me how my child's doing trying to attain those goals.
Eileen, Rhonda had her hand raised. I'm going to jump to her real quick.
Excuse me. I just wanted to point out, Kim had a great question in here. What would make the school change an IEP to a 504 if the child's IQ went down and testing scores? And I just wanted to take a moment to concentrate here on, and I had put an answer in the chat, but one of the things, you know, is when they reevaluated, they may not have continued to qualify. And so then what they did was put a 504 plan in place so that there was some services and support. But the key here is especially considering, because you had pointed out that the child's IQ went down in the testing scores. One of the things, and this is a great example of needing to know exactly what category that they were evaluated under and would qualify, because under each different category that a child qualifies, there are different guidelines for them to qualify for the IEP. And especially if you feel that they still should qualify under the category that they were under or another category, they may need to be reevaluated. So especially given the example that was shared, which we see many times, you know, not just with IQ, but it may be if they're under emotional behavioral disability category, we still have the behaviors going on, but these are perfect examples of we are seeing that things are not improving, but then they don't qualify. So I think it's really important to get them reevaluated, and we can kind of help one-on-one step through the process to see where it is that they're no longer qualifying, and is there then what the options to advocate to get those services in place. So I'm sorry I interrupted, Eileen, but that's a huge thing that we see many times in everything. But it's good though that they put something in place for them if they weren't on the IEP, that they went to the 504 plan. But it may not be what's best for them. They may need that specially designed instruction, which they were getting under the IEP.
I do think that we talk a little bit later too about requesting how often you can ask for another ARC meeting to discuss those concerns just like that, and when you're able to do that. So I know that'll be towards the end. That might also help shine some light on that too. So we're gonna continue on. So extent of non-participation. So it's an explanation of, or the extent, if any, that the child will not participate with non-disabled children in the general education curriculum, extracurricular activities, or other non-academic activities. So this also kind of gets into LRE, or least restrictive environment, that we're going to talk about later. It's to really say, like, if this child is not going to be in that general education classroom, that there has to be a real good reason as to why, and why everyone agrees that this is the best placement for them. So moving on to supplementary aids and services. So this is kind of what everybody goes back to, like, so what are they going to get? How do we know what they're getting? And this is what happens is that in the supplementary aids and services, this is where they're going to understand of what services they're going to receive and how frequently. So it's what the services and modifications are going to be, how often they're going to be provided, where they're going to be provided, and how long they're going to last. So this is like an example where it says exactly, you know, who is going to be giving this aid, and it's speech therapy. They're saying the frequency 5 times a week. It's going to be in the general education setting, meaning that instead of having the child pulled out of the classroom for speech, that the speech therapist is getting pulled into the classroom to try and limit the amount of time any child is pulled outside of that classroom and outside of that learning environment. And then it's also going to have the start and stop date. So normally say beginning and ending. Normally they have it about a year in between. And then how long are they going to be doing these interventions or these accommodations or modifications? So that one was 20 minutes.
I did want to hop in there and say this is a really important part to look over on your students' IEP as well, especially you know, if this is not your very first ARC or IEP meeting. You know, when we're going in for our yearlies, once our students have already had their IEPs, making sure that the beginning and end dates are updated appropriately and that they match the school year or school season that we're in. Because if those dates are off, the school doesn't legally have to provide that service. So, and it's error. We all make mistakes. We're all human, and we all love technology, right? And these take place on a computer. So just making sure that you're overlooking those dates and how they're written to make sure that they're accurate for the school season.
Absolutely. And that the frequency and the duration is accurate as well. Because we don't, sometimes when you're in those meetings and they talk about these services, they'll say, oh yeah, we're going to see them, you know, 5 times a week. That's about right. But then if it's not written down, if it's not documented in that form, not documented, it's not going to be done. And so it's just about making sure that everybody's I's are dotted and T's are crossed, because this is where the actual, you know, rubber hits the road kind of a situation. This is where those services are going to be legally held in place for the child. So next up is modifications and accommodations. So a modification means a change in what is being taught or expected from the student. An accommodation is going to be a change that helps the student overcome or work around the disability. So we're just going to use the examples here. So for modification, making an assignment easier so that the student is not doing the same level of work as other students is an example of a modification. Or a shortened assignment. So students still have to do the same level or skill of work, but maybe not as much as other students. My example is that my child he struggles with writing skills. So we always ask the school, do you want the skill or do you want the knowledge? Because he has difficulty giving both the same as his peers. So every child needs to write. So if they're all writing 10 sentences and it takes them 30 minutes, my child may need to write 3 sentences and it takes 30 minutes, where he's still on grade level and still making that same effort towards it. But at the same time, he's putting in just as much effort and is still learning the skill the same as his peers are. So an accommodation, allowing a student who has trouble writing to give answers orally is an example of an accommodation. So they're expected to let them know the same material and answer the same questions, but they don't have to physically write them down. That's actually one of the accommodations that my child has, is that if he was in the middle of taking a test and they had to write an entire essay, he wouldn't be able to write an essay in the same amount of time. So he's able to use speech to text or a scribe, somebody that will write for him. He still has to give all that knowledge, but that accommodation allows him to now show his knowledge at the same level of his peers and not allowing his disability to hinder him from participating. So next up we have is accommodations, and these are just a little tiny snippet of some of the things that can be listed as accommodations. So visual prompts, previewing questions, organizers, listening guides, large print materials, braille, reader. So if your child is making it difficult, we were just talking about writing and having a scribe to have them write, the same thing can happen for reading to make sure that they are receiving the information. Manipulative, extended time, interpreters, calculators, kids with dyscalculia and other issues, and other uses of technology to make sure that those children are accommodated so that they can participate inside of the classroom. So transition, so beginning no later, like I think we said this earlier, that when the child is 16 or younger if determined, but it's 8th grade or the age of 14 in Kentucky, that's when we have those transition meetings and start kind of handing the reins over to the child so they can do their own self-advocacy. And I think one of our handouts actually has some more information on this as well to try and help. Let's see, special factors to consider. So the IEP must consider special factors associated with, and the next several slides are going to give a whole bunch of different things. So first up is behavior. Children whose behavior impedes their learning or the learning of others. So there's a bunch of different special factors that they have to accommodate for, and behavior is one of them. And this is where you go back to the goals where they were functional goals. And so sometimes the behavior is when they're taken out of the classroom, they're no longer able to access education. So behavior is something that you can take into consideration as something to help a child that you can put as a goal into their IEP. Next up is going to be limited English proficiency. So the language and communication needs of kids who are limited English. So English is a second language. We got to make sure that we're giving these kids those resources. This also includes, on the next slide, stuff about instructions in Braille. So children that are visually blind or impaired, that they have access to however they need to access education. Next up is going to be communication needs. Communication needs of all children, with an emphasis on those who are deaf or hard of hearing. I don't want to say obviously, but we can see that children who are deaf and hard of hearing, that they may require extra assistive devices for them to hear and participate meaningfully. But it also is for children that maybe are nonverbal and able, might need another way to communicate their needs. Excuse me. And so that's something that they want to take into consideration. And then, so assistive technology and services, so they have to consider the child's disability to see if they need to have something like an AAC device, which is an alternative augmentative communication device. And that's a lot of times like the iPads that you might see kids with, who, if they're maybe autistic and nonverbal, that they're using those to communicate their needs. But that's something that the IEP team needs to take into consideration and work with the child on. And then next up, we have placement. So the placement can occur in a range of settings, including regular classroom, special education classroom, a pull-out program, or even a separate school. So in the state of Kentucky, we have a couple of schools like the Kentucky School for the Deaf, and we have the Kentucky School for the Blind, where those children's environment or where they're placed was not in their normal public education setting, that they needed to have their services pulled out to a different school. But that's something that we're going to talk about now with LRE and the least restrictive environment, because we want to do everything we can to keep kids in the classroom before we start pulling them out to make sure that they're able to access education. So next up is defining the least restrictive environment, or LRE. This is the last thing inside of an IEP meeting that's decided. So we decide everything else, what the child needs first, before deciding where this child is going to be receiving this. So the public agency must ensure to the maximum extent appropriate that their children with disabilities are educated with their peers of non-disabled children. So this isn't, again, special education is not a room, it's not a place. It is wherever the child needs to be. So let's see, we're going to continue defining the least restrictive environment. So special classes and separate schooling, or the other removal of children with disabilities from the regular education environment occurs only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that the education in a regular class with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. It does not mean that as soon as a child needs some sort of assistance that they automatically are taken out of that classroom. Just because you have an autism diagnosis does not mean that your child was forced into an autism classroom. That is like one of the last choices that we do. It's not the first thing that you go to.
Hey, me again. I just wanted to pop in and also remind folks, when we're talking about least restrictive environment, that's not just inside the building. So this would also pertain to transportation, and the buses that the students ride to get to the school as well, making sure that they're in their least restrictive environment there, as well as any field trips or extracurriculars too.
Well, and I also, Eileen's going to be like, here they both go. I also want to point out that what Eileen said about that, you need to bring in those services and support. So even if you have a disability that may be a very severe disability, does not mean that you cannot be successful in the regular education classroom. The need or the amount of need of certain aids or services to be successful in there does not determine if we're going to do it or not. Is it what's best for the child? And has the child been given every opportunity to thrive in that environment with the supports and services that they need? This is not a decision based on you have this, just like Eileen said, you have a certain disability, and we're making our decision based on that or a spot that may be available. What's critical is, and many times I always, I'm going to share a story. So I always like to use the example of, so my brother Grant does have significant physical disabilities, has cerebral palsy, and is legally blind. So he does need some significant physical help with that, right? But cognitively, he can probably run the class. I'm just going to be honest, okay? So just because he needs those extensive supports doesn't mean he shouldn't have that opportunity. My twin sister had a severe learning disability, and for certain classes, especially when it had to do with math, she would go to resource room. So during the math time, what was appropriate for her was she would go to the resource room and work on her math, right? So see where on the surface where everybody would typically judge that Robin wouldn't have been in the special classroom for that certain amount of time, and they assumed that Grant would be for all of his time. Again, that's the wonderful thing. We go back to individualize. What helps them be successful? And that is then where you make the decisions after you've already attempted for things to be successful and how we can support one another. So, sorry, Eileen, I had to throw that out there.
No, that's a perfect segue. If we go to the next slide here, it's something that talks about, so for LRE, so individual placement, the placement decisions must be based on a child's unique needs and IEP and not administrative convenience, a disability or a program label, or allocation of funds. So just like Rhonda was saying, like just because a child has a particular diagnosis doesn't mean they automatically go to that room. We have to see what that child needs in the general education classroom and exhaust all options there to keep them before we start moving to taking them out. So I think somebody's going to say something. So
Me, I'm back again. Well, I love what you just said, but also I want to throw in there too, fear, right? So we have to be very cautious too when we're working. It's all a partnership, and when we're partnering with our schools on the needs of our children, also discussing fears that they may have, because they may be fearful of your student's disability because they don't know much about it. And that's something that I have dealt with for many years with my oldest child. And in a situation, they wanted to place her on the special needs bus for transport, in fear of what could potentially happen to her if she was on a general bus route. And so just working with them and educating them on your student's disability, and how their disability can be affected, as well as their mental health too, right? We have to look at their individualized need, and by helping to educate the schools on your student's disability, it will drop some of that fear of the unknown that they may have, but also keeping your student where they need to be placed themselves, at where they are in their least restrictive environment. Now I'm going to go away.
okay, so on the next slide, this is the continuum of alternative placements. So you can see, like, on the left side, this is the less restrictive environment. This is, normally this is the goal for all students, to stay inside the regular educational classes. But when that's not possible, then we have some more restrictive, where there can be special classes that they pull out for, special schools, school for the blind, school for the deaf. Sometimes the child's home is the best place. There's homebound programs. And then it can even go into whether or not the child needs to have be hospitalized or in an institution. Just because they're there doesn't mean that education stops. It means that we now have to meet them at that environment. So continuing on, so for placement decisions, they're made by a group of persons, including the parents who are knowledgeable, but everyone should know about the child, know the meaning of all the evaluation data. Like we said earlier, it can't be the janitor making this decision. We need somebody that understands it. And then the placement options that are available. So it's not done based on, I can't say it enough, it's not convenience. It's not just the classroom that they want to shove everybody into. It's education, and special education happens where the student is. So for those placements, it has to be determined at least annually, because every year we know that kids change. They're very, they're able to adapt to their environment. So while last year maybe being in a more highly structured classroom was what this child needed, but we need to make sure that every single year that we are looking at it again with new eyes, and not saying, well, this is what we did before, we're going to continue on. We're going to always relook at that every year, saying, how do we keep these children inside the general education classroom? And then if not, what do we need to do? So it should be also based off of the child's IEP. It should be as close to home as close as possible to the child's home. So that's where you kind of get into, well, we might have a particular classroom for autism kids, but it's, a couple schools over. Well, is that really the best place for the child to be? Or is there a place inside of their home school that they could actually access those same strategies, those same supports? And then unless the child's IEP requires another arrangement, they should be educated at the school where they would attend if they had no disabilities. So we tend to refer to that as the child's home school, or the school that they would normally be placed in the district. And then just to read Rhonda's note, she said also placement does not determine access to general curriculum and completing the curriculum. Our students are students first. Absolutely. So let's see, on the next slide, we have, so consideration must be given to any potential harmful effect on the child on the quality of services that he or she needs. A child with a disability may not be removed from education in age-appropriate or regular classrooms solely because of the needed modifications in the general education curriculum. And that's also kind of goes along what Amber was saying, like, just because the school is scared of a particular disability doesn't mean they get to just, well, we don't understand it, so we're just going to hide it away over in the corner. That's not how this works. The school has to really consider the harmful effects of taking that child out of the general education classroom can have on them before making those decisions. Next up, so there's placement in certain circumstances. Like I said, all these are going to be in the handouts. These are all clickable links, which will kind of give you more information on these very specific instances, which tend to come up, but we don't really have time to go very in-depth into them. So we did want to make sure that you had access to that. So it's about school discipline and those procedures, safeguards, and things like that. Next up, so participation in extracurricular or non-academic services and activities. So the public agency or the school has to ensure that the child has supplementary aids and services determined to be appropriate and necessary by the child's IEP team to participate in non-academic and extracurricular services and activities. So this includes mealtime, recess, after-school clubs, transportation. The school is still required to give assistance, athletics, and much, much more. So just because it's an after-school club or just because it's the bus transportation to and from school, if your child requires some sort of accommodation, modification, or support during those times, the school is required, once the IEP team or the ARC team decides that it's needed, to ensure that child does receive those supports. So overall, like, I don't know how many times I said it, but special education is not a place. It is a setup of services and support. So where a child with a disability receives that special education services is that child's placement. And that's just something that the ARC team decides. And you are an equal member of that ARC team, willing to help that child. So starting to wrap up here. So let's see here. When will the IEP be implemented? So we've done all this stuff. We wrote goals. We figured out where and when and how. So when do they have to get it started? As soon as possible following the development of the IEP. So special education and related services must be made available to the child exactly how the IEP states it will be available to the child. So everyone who is going to be in, around, helping, accessing your child's education, they have to have access to the IEP to know what those supplementary aids and services are, or specially designed instructions. They must be informed of their specific responsibilities. So we know the physical therapist is going to come so many days a week. They have their schedule, and they must be informed of specific accommodations, modifications, and supports to be provided to the child in accordance to the IEP. This also includes that there is a substitute teacher for the day. That substitute teacher should have access to your child's IEP and be able to do all the accommodations and modifications that would happen, whether or not it's for, like I said, a substitute teacher or the child's general education teacher. Those should still be implemented at all times. So once the IEP is completed, the agency must give the parents a copy of the IEP at no cost to the parent. Sometimes they have you walk out of the meeting with it. I know me personally, they always send it a couple of days later because they made a draft and they want to make sure all the wording is correct. But you are entitled to have a physical copy given to you so that you're able to, again, meaningfully participate and understand everything that's going on. So reviewing and revising the IEP. So it says periodically, but not less than annually. So at least once a year, there should be, if your child has an IEP, your child should be coming together with the ARC team and meeting and reviewing those goals. Are they still appropriate? Has anything changed in the present levels? Is anything that we're working on, maybe a goal, we've hit a goal, we've finished, that's what we all want. We want to make those goals. But if for whatever reason we're not making those goals, why are we not? Do we need to change something along the way? You can also request a meeting at any time. So if it is not your annual meeting, let's say it's at the end of the year in May, but in December, you're like, man, there's something different. I think we're missing something. I have questions. You have concerns. You can request, normally we say to request in writing, to have another ARC meeting and then the school will be able to give you prior written notice to set it up, and then you can discuss those concerns at that time. So you'll have at least one meeting a year, but you can have more than that, and it's dependent on the child's success and what the school needs to do to support that child. Next up is meeting without a meeting. So does the team have to physically meet the parents if the school wants to amend or modify the IEP? No, it is not necessarily something that you have to meet with, but it is something that you have to do it with only certain conditions. So on the next slide, we talk about when does this actually occur. It occurs for changes being made to the child's IEP after the annual meeting with the school during that year, and only if the school agrees not to have the meeting and the parents agree that they don't need that meeting. And so they also have to make sure that it's documented, and if they need to modify anything, that the parent and the school both have to agree upon that. So last up, coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, and working together is success. I know this is a lot of information in a very short amount of time. I want to be mindful of everyone's time here because it's almost done. But on the next couple of slides, we have like a vocabulary list of words to know. Again, this will be in the handout, so I'm not going to go over these in detail. But this kind of gives an idea of the, what do we call it, the word soup, the alphabet soup that you hear a lot between IDEA and IEP to try and give you insight as to what some of those words are. So that way, when you are going to those meetings, you do have a little bit of knowledge on your side, so you're not overwhelmed or intimidated when they start going through that alphabet soup. So I think I'm going to hand it back over to Amber here for questions, I think.
I'm just going to check the chat real quick. Okay. Just want to, and I'm going to, as I'm speaking here, please feel free if you have a question that you'd like to throw in there before we end. I just want to thank everyone for taking some time out of their day to come and join us and hopefully learn a little something new about the IEP process. We would like to ask you to take just a moment to fill out our evaluation. There's a QR code here on the screen, as well as an evaluation link in the chat. If you do need a certificate of attendance for coming today, that will automatically generate upon the completion of the evaluation. We take those very seriously. We want to make sure that anything that we train on or any information that we put out is meaningful to our folks across the state. So please let us know what you loved, maybe something you'd like to hear more of. And once again, we just want to thank you for coming to visit today. We encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. We have a Kentucky Spin e-news as well as a youth news that comes out monthly, and you can find that on our website at www.kyspin.com. And I'm going to check the chat one more time. I'm not seeing any questions come in. I want to thank each and every one of you again, and hopefully we see you very soon.